Well, hi everyone. Here we are, and we're going to be thinking about and talking about some articles by the philosopher Philip Goff. So I just want to give what I hope will be a very quick background to some of Philip Goff's work and how I came across it. I came across it through the College of Stoic Philosophers Cosmic Consciousness course and Philip Goff's book called Why. I think it's called Why the Meaning of the Universe or something. The Purpose of the Universe, I think. It's a very good book. And I think Goff is a very good communicator. So while, we usually discuss something from literature, today's readings are not literature, they're journalism, but they're journalism about important philosophical topics. So they're about what used to be called, I guess, metaphysics. And very briefly, and we did read some Descartes early in our group, didn't we, Courtney? A few years ago, we read some Descartes. Basically, when Descartes was doing his reflections, his meditations, and he eventually established his own existence, that was good, but he also was thinking about mind and body, and he came to the conclusion that satisfied him that there was such a thing as mind and there was such a thing as body. What he was less convincing about, or less compelling about, I suppose, was how those two things interacted. And that remained one of the problems with his worldview. The other problem with his worldview is that when you've got two kind of spheres of things in the world, the bodily and the non-bodily, that kind of seems like one thing too many. And so there's a temptation to kind of cut one of those out. And that temptation was certainly taken by George Berkeley, Bishop of Cloyne in Ireland in the early 18th century. He decided that it was fitting with Christian kind of ideas that you just decide everything's actually spirit, everything's idea. The chairs and tables you think are there, well, they're actually spirit and idea as well. That was called idealism. And it kind of was the dominant worldview in philosophical terms for really nearly another 200 years. But as through the 19th century, when the growth of science was more and more compelling, that kind of started to seem less so. And in the 20th century, with a more materialist worldview, there were decades where the scientific world, I suppose, was treating the human person as a scientific subject, the brain as something to be studied. And curiously, one big strand in that movement was called Australian materialism. So philosophers like David Armstrong, who was a friend of my dad's, that very big in this kind of reductive idea that mind states really are just brain states in one form or another. But that project also seemed to hit a bit of a dead end. And then ironically, in the 1990s, it was another Australian philosopher, David Chalmers, who kind of changed the playing field. Chalmers came to the conclusion that really just doing more and more of the sciencey stuff, more of the measurement and whatever, probably isn't going to solve what he termed the hard problem of consciousness. So the way he phrased it, there's the so-called easy problem of consciousness, and that isn't really easy, but that's the neuroscientific side of things. That's brain scans, scientists working out what different areas of the brain are doing, all that neuroscience stuff. That's the so-called easy problem. The hard problem is what we're to make of subjective experience. The way that you and I experience the world, when we're maybe listening to some music, but then we're also thinking about the friend who introduced us to that piece of music, and then where we were living when we were talking to that friend, or that's the stuff that's always going on with us as humans. And you can't say it's not a thing. It really is a thing. In fact, it's possibly the most human thing that we know, it's the most familiar to us, is our own subjective experience. So when Chalmers kind of put this out there in the 90s, and it was kind of accepted, really, broadly speaking, that yes, you can't just dismiss or discard subjective experience, because that's how we are in the world. And it's not just humans either. I mean, it's obvious that the higher mammals, certainly, they have some kinds of subjective experiences. They certainly have pain. They seem to, dogs and cats have enjoyment. So, yeah, it's not even just humans that have these subjective experiences. And so that's definitely a thing in the world. And so you've got to be able to account for it. Now, if you don't want to account for it with the Cartesian dualism or the Platonist variant of it, or the Christian variant of it. So if you don't want to postulate that there's two things in the world because of the problems that that brings with it, what are you left with? Now, so there was the idealist solution, making everything to do with spirit and mind. Well, that had been tried, and that was pretty unsatisfactory. In the 19th century, an alternative was called emergentism. And interestingly, it was another Australian who kind of was a pioneer of that. And this was after Darwin's Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. So this Australian philosopher called Samuel Alexander, I think he was the first to come up with this idea that, and it's a plausible kind of idea, that when organisms achieved a certain degree of complexity in the evolutionary process, that consciousness or subjective experience somehow emerged out of that physical development. So yeah, that's got a lot of kind of intuitive appeal, but also in the end, that gets reduced to dualism as well. Really, that's a kind of saying, well, here's a non-physical stuff arising out of a physical stuff. So it doesn't really kind of, it doesn't really solve the problem if we're trying to work out how all these things interact together. So Chalmers' own position, I think, and don't quote me because I'm not that familiar with his work, is a kind of emergentism. I think he kind of goes with this notion that subjective experience somehow or other arises out of a certain level of biological complexity. As I say, it's got some appeal, but it's also got some drawbacks as well, which is that effectively you're postulating two different kinds of stuff. So it was in response to all this, and with all that in the background, that Philip Goff has come along and said, look, basically, it's not just through doing more neuroscience that we're going to come to an understanding of what subjective experience is or how it really fits in. And so his idea is really leaning towards the idea that there's a basic level of consciousness inherent in the world. So there's not two separate kinds of stuff. There's one kind of stuff, which is the world, but also the world has this property or this aspect, which is of a form of consciousness, even at the most basic level of the building blocks of stuff. That's and he calls this this level of not consciousness, but in very small or very simple structures, he calls it's not consciousness, obviously, but it could be some level of agency. And so he calls it pan-agentialism. So pan meaning everything in Greek, and agentialism to do with agency. This idea that even the most basic forms in the world, and that would be very simple structures, have some form of agency, which in more as the forms and the structures get more sophisticated, manifests as what we know as consciousness. So that's kind of what he's putting forward. And I think he wanted to avoid terms like panpsychism, which is an older term to do with there being soul in everything, because that brings connotations of itself. What it actually, and the reason why, of course, the College of Stoic Philosophers is running a course on it, is that it actually looks at a reasonable amount like a Stoic idea that everything is physical, but it's got physical with properties, including a high degree of interagency between the elements in the world, that we're all elements in this causal network, all acting, and so is everything else. So that's why it's a good fit in some ways with Stoicism, although as far as I know, Goff hasn't actually kind of made that link himself. So with that all in the background, I'm just going to, and as I said in the Facebook group, I couldn't open up the Scientific American ones after a certain point because they wanted to impose a paywall. But if I go to the first of those conversation articles.
Strangely, those science ones worked for me. At
I
least
think
a
it was just the
couple of them.
number of times I'd clicked on it, Courtney. I think it's just,
Oh,
because I'd been in once or twice, and then they wanted an
yeah.
account out of me. Um, so, but yeah, but actually, perhaps before we discuss the actual articles, did either of you want to make any comments?
I think you kind of covered everything I read. Um, he just threw up a few sort of interesting examples as well that kind of, I guess, fleshed out some of the background you just gave, like the philosophical zombie stuff and um, yeah, that's what stands out for me. That idea that the problem with emergentism, for example, he says in that the mystery of consciousness deeper than we thought article, the first one, he says he comes up with this very strange kind of counter example where he says um, that the task is, what does he say? He says um, the hard problem is a kind of chimera. If it makes sense to separate out consciousness and behavior functioning, then it also makes sense to mix and match them in weird ways. And he gives us some strange examples like color inverts and the pain pleasure invert. That it's conceivable that um, we could have been the kind of creature that experienced pain when we were eating or doing something that we would normally in this universe call pleasurable, and vice versa. And we could still presumably um, be the kind of creature that could still pass on its genetic material, like it wouldn't necessarily get in the way of us breeding. Um, so that problem that arises from emergentism, you call it, the physicalist explanation, um, is sort of resolved if you stop thinking about it in terms of um, physicalism. And so he goes on to suggest what you said, that maybe panpsychism or some version of it is a better alternative. And he says something interesting about the evolutionary uh, the evolutionary argument offers a challenge that complex behavior can exist in a system without conscious experience. He says um, the evolution of consciousness is a deep mystery only under the reductionist paradigm, according to which behavior is determined at the micro level, making it irrelevant whether or not consciousness pops up at high levels. So he's sort of suggesting that if we want to advance our understanding of consciousness, that we should abandon these reductionist paradigms because it will kind of pave the way to like a kind of a perspective that isn't hindered in the same way that the reductionist kind of paradigm hinders thinking about consciousness. So, I mean, there's some of my takeaways if that's helpful.
Yeah. So the role of evolution, all this is really interesting, I think, and um, I, and without being any kind of a specialist, there certainly seem to be gaps in the evolutionary account of how things like consciousness may have developed. I mean, there are different theories about it, some more plausible than others, but it does seem to be not something that evolutionary theory is very well equipped to examine, just to put it mildly. Um, but yeah, so and of course this is all kind of very kind of countercultural, and that's partly why Goff is quite cautious in his phrasing and in the way he's put his views out there in the public domain, because from a scientific point of view, I mean, the idea of suggesting that there's consciousness at some degree in everything is pretty wacky, pretty out there, and but so I think he's actually been quite courageous in what he's put forward. I think kind of disappointingly, I think recently he's actually converted to Christianity, which kind of is like, oh, okay. So now you've gone back to that worldview, but but of a peculiar kind, I guess. So
Maybe it
yeah,
maybe it
sorry, go on,
helps.
Claude.
Maybe it helps in part to um, just be careful what we mean by consciousness, because obviously it would be easy for a new reader like myself, perhaps, to think the chair thinks of itself like a person does or something, and that's not quite what's meant, is it? It's But there's this idea, if we go back to that article we read a while ago about what it's like to be a bat, which had a pretty standard, and I think this is the view of consciousness he's sort of referring to, what it's like to be that kind of thing, that there's an awareness of um, what it's like to be like a bat, for example. So maybe in theory, there's a sense, some sort of basic sense in which there's an awareness um, of what it's like. There's a felt sense, in a sense, of what it's like to be a particle in space or something. It's conceivable. I think. I mean, why not? It's conceivable, isn't it? I mean, I might struggle to think that you guys sitting here have an internal life because I've never experienced it before. And but it's the same problem, isn't it? Like, why not other things like trees and of a different type of consciousness, but nonetheless, some sort of experience of what it's like to be the thing that it is in the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Courtney, because yes, we did read Thomas Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And that's an article from the 1970s, and it's an absolutely classic piece in the history of kind of this research, really, or this period of this way of thinking. And Thomas Nagel in 2012 published a book called God and oh, sorry, not God, Mind and Cosmos. So Nagel also has come round to a kind of a position of thinking that the kind of evolutionary account is pretty unsatisfactory in a lot of respects. And yeah, maybe there are other ways in which mind is more extended and more pervasive than we might think. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right to bring that forward. Interestingly, and you raised the point of Courtney about that article. What is it like to be a bat? Again, this is where the Stoics were way ahead of it because they had this account. Oikeiosis in the Stoic worldview is at its very basic level, it's the awareness that the organism has of its own being and its own body and how to use it. It's really at the most basic level, but it is a form of consciousness. And so they were spot on about every organism having that capacity. Nowadays we call it proprioception. It's the latest thing, right? But the Stoics were all onto it. And there's evidence that even single-celled organisms, so bacteria, will move themselves to a more preferable condition, with more nutrition or whatever it might be. So that is definitely a form of agency, and that's there in single-celled organisms. So, that to me suggests that there is a far more pervasive extent of not consciousness exactly, but what Goff calls agentialism, agency at one level or another.
Yeah, that's a good point. And awareness of your body in such a way that you know how to use it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, on a sort of interesting note, um, it's weird. I mean, it doesn't really follow from what you're saying. I just thought it was weird. You just reminded me that there's this kind of jellyfish in the ocean called the immortal jellyfish. Have you heard of it? It's weird, man. My kids were asking me about how long certain animals live. It turns out this jellyfish, talking about how it knows what to do, can actually revert itself to a kind of larval stage, and then in a sense it starts to regrow itself. And so in theory it can live forever. It's bizarre. So that obviously scientists are looking at that as, because how can we live forever? But just weird how the nature just knows how to use its bodies in the most kind of novel ways. And it's a fairly basic organism, obviously, a jellyfish. But anyway.
Well, yeah, but to your point as well about it, I mean, basic. So just going back to the easy problem of consciousness for a minute, one of the animals, there are, I mean, fortunately these days that there's a lot of restrictions on on animal research, but one of the animals that a lot of neuroscientific research is done on is the roundworm. And the roundworm has, I think, 300 neurons. Humans have like 80 billion in their nervous system and brains. So in a sense, they're working on a model that only approximates a higher animal, a higher nervous system. So there's one of your problems in the first place, that even the easy problem is very constrained in what it can look at, and knowledge proceeds very slowly, even on that basis, in terms of neuroscientific research. So yeah, even on the scientific side of things, we don't really know what we're doing yet. Well, they don't really. They know a lot in some ways, but they know a lot. Oh, so just on this, and this kind of, it'll sound random, but it's actually related. There's an article just came out today about a specialist in Adelaide who is an anaesthetist. He's proposing a completely novel treatment of chronic pain. Now, pain is one of the things that's, of course, been a subject of a lot of neuroscientific research, because it's such an urgent phenomenon is one reason, but also because that's something that's more readily traceable scientifically. Now, this specialist in Adelaide says with his radically different treatment, out of 200 patients with chronic pain, over 170 have experienced complete relief. So he's targeting the nervous system in a completely different way, not through the brain, but through the periphery. So that's basically the idea. But my broader point is, well, hang on, if we've been getting pain treatment that wrong, and that being such an urgent and such a widespread problem, what haven't we been getting wrong with neuroscience? I mean, that is also, my idea around the easy problem. Yeah, that's the easy. Remember, that's the easy problem. So, I make that point just to say that that neuroscience in itself is incredibly difficult, but also maybe we don't even know as much as we might think about the easy problem, leaving aside the hard problem.
I think that's a point that Goff makes too, because he says that, and this is interesting because when you, as an educator, when you're talking about the way the brain works, for example, um, the textbooks often make it sound like it's very well understood and very well mapped out. And Goff is saying here in one of his articles that, well, we might understand the basic chemistry of the brain pretty well, and we understand the larger structures of the brain, but we have basically next to no understanding of what's going on at the neuronal level, at the individual cellular level. We got like fucking zip, no idea, pretty much. It's very, and he's like, we've got a long way to go if we could ever get down to that level, you know? So whenever scientists or interpreters, if you like, take MRIs and other brain scans and then try and talk about those macro structures of the brain, it's only ever happening at the level of interpretation. It's not nearly at all an exact kind of science. And this is something that also comes up in critical psychiatry and critical psychology, which we've talked about before, about the rhetoric of using brain scans to kind of convince people they have a mental illness, when in fact, like you're seeing from this kind of article, it's just interpretation. It's not scientific when you approach it from such a like broad kind of picture landscape without any of the kind of micro level understanding that would be required to kind of understand, that sort of behavior, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of sobering, isn't it, to think that, yeah, yeah, maybe we're not, or maybe even the experts aren't as well informed as we might assume.
Well, I think it's really important to remember how rhetorical the sciences are, because Foucault, for example, talked about the discourses of power. And if you go into, say, I don't know, like drug and alcohol counseling or anger management or all those sorts of things. It's very common for the therapist to go, your brain is like this fist. This is like the reptilian part of the brain, and there's like a like some sort of emotional center under there, and the cortex goes over the top. And when you freak out, you flip your lid. And I've always thought it's the dumbest thing ever, but a lot of people go, that's so amazing. That really helped me understand how to get a grip on my anger. But if you think about it, it's a metaphor. It's a complete metaphor, but it's often delivered as if this is kind of scientific knowledge. And that's really interesting, especially when you think about how primitive the symbolism here is. Like, of course, your brain's not my fist, it's ridiculous. But anyway, that's what they do.
Yep. Okay. All right. So so I'm just looking at the first of the conversation articles, and Goff is kind of setting out one of the scenarios that he's, I guess, working with. He says, for example, suppose we discover scientifically that a certain form of brain activity is correlated with the conscious experience of an organism. The physicalist will interpret this as the form of organization which turns non-conscious physical processes, such as electrical signals between brain cells, into conscious experience, whereas the panpsychist will interpret it as the form of organization which unifies individual conscious particles into one larger conscious system. So he's kind of flipped the focus from the emergent side of things to the inherent presence of consciousness informing everything else. It's a really interesting way of approaching it. I think he's put it in terms that we can kind of understand, which is great. But yeah, you can see he's proposing something quite revolutionary here, or in the scientific um, in the scientific world that we live in. And he says, thus we find two very different philosophical interpretations of the same scientific data. And then he goes on, if we can't work out which view is right with an experiment, how can we choose between them? And then we then get to the meta-scientific approach, which is actually a philosophical approach. Well, what kind of theory do we prefer? Do we prefer one that's simpler, more unified? In general, yes. And so on that basis, we might be tempted, as he does, to reject dualism in all its forms, and instead think that really the consciousness kind of stuff is actually inherent. Now, yeah, it's probably hard to overstate how kind of annoyed a lot of people would get by what he's saying here, particularly people who are very invested in a scientific worldview.
He makes a really good point, very clear point that the dualism of science is really good at explaining how matter should behave or how matter will behave, so that we can exploit it and dominate it and use it. But it never at any point gives us any insight into what matter actually is itself in itself. And I think that's kind of the same problem as the problem of consciousness is, yeah, science is really good at behavior prediction, knowing how things might happen, statistical things and things like that, right? But never what the thing is in itself. And I think that's why
And then
psychology really struggles, because they can make statistical models of behavior, but they can never account for human agency, and they get really stuck on those sorts of problems.
another of the things he raised in his book and goes through in a way that even I could understand was modern quantum physics is really weird. And during the 20th century, that was another big problem with the materialist kind of perspective, because matter in its simplest forms was just behaving strangely. When you've got particles that behave at point like a wave and another point like a particle, or when you've got quantum entanglement whereby electrons at a distance still seem to be kind of co-moving or um, there seems to be these strange connections within some of these basic physics processes that nobody really could understand. I mean, that's the other thing. What's it called? Superposition, when an electron is spinning up and it's spinning down at the same time, depending on how it's observed. I mean, these things are really weird, and they didn't really submit to the 20th century kind of standard theoretical models. They kind of upended them. And so in a sense,
there's the uncertainty theorem too, isn't there? Which is you can predict the position of the electron or the speed that's traveling at, but not both simultaneously. And the closer you get to pinning one of those variables down, the more variance seems to appear in the other, something like that. It's pretty weird.
yeah, that's right. And the observer effect, the fact that somebody's standing over these particles doing their thing seems to have an impact. It's like, whoa. So yeah, that kind of threw a spanner really in the mid 20th century into all this stuff anyway. So if we're going to be embracing some pretty weird stuff, we might as well embrace some even weirder stuff. Although really, when you think about it, maybe not as weird, by thinking that maybe matter, however we understand that, even at the simplest levels, has some form of agency. So that's where Goff's coming from.
Well, and
And
with his idea of coherence and his idea of simplicity, it kind of makes sense to at least give it some thought, or at least to bracket out our kind of what's the word? Disbelief for a minute. Yeah.
Catherine, Courtney and I have been rabbiting on. What do you think of all this?
I've had so many thoughts, so many random things that I've sort of jotted down so I don't forget, because I tend to kind of go off on tangents and random things. But probably the first random thing would be, I know, Courtney, you mentioned that jellyfish. Yesterday in the first aid course I did, there was, and I forget the name of what it was, some kind of sea creature. But it was 3 individuals in one. So 3 separate individuals like in one, but it was like 3 creatures as one. And it just got me thinking, and we've been talking about, the number, is it dual or is it 1 or 2? And I think that there's something just particularly significant about the number 3. And I can't sort of articulate that, but sort of that trinity, like I think there's definitely something in, mind, body, spirit. Obviously in religion there's a trinity. Like the number 3 is just, I don't know, there's something just super special about the number 3, and I'm not sure how mathematically that occurs in nature, but I think there's something in that, not sure what. But thinking about the brain, like organically in the left and the right hemispheres, like they function differently. So like we've got one brain, but it's really 2. And I think it's, what is it? Going back to my psychology 101 days, like they're opposite sides. So, like if you have a stroke on the left, your right side will be affected. And your left side is normally your logical side, and your right side's your more creative, visual side. So like the 2 different brains have different functions. And I was thinking too about, there was a philosophy course I did on consciousness, and the differentiation between primary and secondary consciousness. So primary consciousness being like what animals have, like a primordial awareness, not so much a thought, just more of a being. And then secondary, thinking, rationality, language, all that sort of higher order processing. And I think there's definitely something in that. I think it was Rouillet, the philosopher in the 50s, who did like cybernetics and machine learning, that sort of thing, that differentiated the 2 consciousness. I haven't read it, but just heard the lectures about it. And then I was thinking like about what you were saying about plants and things. I think there was some research saying plants do communicate. So, maybe there is a materialist base, but we just don't have the right instruments to measure the interactions and the complexity of everything. And I suppose I was thinking about like the earth, like obviously we're people on earth, but something I find fascinating is space. Like, I think it's about 100 kilometers up. There's then that sort of area where it's between sort of earth and space, but it sort of peters out into space. But like, there's no actual, like the diagrams, there's no actual boundary. It just kind of, disappears into space. And I just find that like so amazing. And it's sort of like, we breathe air, we sort of just disappear into the world. When you mentioned, Judith, the anaesthetist, I actually read an article last year. I think there was one that came out that was like ridiculously long. I can find it and try and put it in the group, but I didn't fully read it. But I just, I was interested in drug interactions and altered states of consciousness. And there were 3 things mentioned that actually totally cut off the mind-body connection. And 2 drugs and 1 was meditation. So advanced meditation can totally be a dissociative experience. But the 2 drugs were ketamine and propofol, which are used by anaesthetists for pain and for sedation and anaesthetics. And so I went up to an anaesthetist at work last year and I asked him, so what's particularly unique? I said, I've just read this, and I might add, I have never had ketamine. I had propofol, which I know killed Michael Jackson when I had a procedure. And I came out of that, I had a bad reaction to fentanyl and vomited once. So I said, give me something else. They gave me propofol. I came out quite elated, on quite a high. And so, yeah, I was quite interested because I'd had that experience. I came out feeling really good after the medical procedure. And the anaesthetist said, he said, ketamine totally cuts off the mind body. You can cut someone's leg off, cut their arm off, and they won't feel a thing. And propofol, apparently you're not meant to get high on that, but I was like, well, I feel like I have. So I thought, well, it's also subjective, isn't it? But yeah, like it's always stuck in my mind that meditation, propofol, and ketamine can just totally, in the brain somehow cut that mind-body experience. And I don't know if I've done some meditation too and had some sort of strange experiences. I had what was observed to be a seizure once, and that was sort of a very different subjective experience for me. And I have, as I sort of mentioned earlier, been in some fairly traumatic experiences where I have sort of dissociated from my body. So yeah, I just find it all so fascinating and such a mystery, really. And then I sort of think, well, does it really matter? Maybe we should just focus on what we do with the consciousness and being more conscious and being kinder. And, does it even really matter? Because it's sort of like origins. We don't know the origin of the world either. If you oppose it to matter, like there's so much, but does it really matter, like in how you actually live your life? Or are you just sort of banging your head against a brick wall? I don't know. That's just my random thoughts. So.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, fascinating, Catherine. Yeah, and just to be clear about the mind-body thing, and nobody would deny, I guess, that brain events have an impact on your experience, obviously. So if, for example, you get a big knock on the head, you're probably going to feel unwell, you're going to have a headache or whatever. So yes, subjective experience is obviously related closely to brain processes. It's just that we're actually no closer than we ever were to working out how that is the case. So yeah, I think Goff wouldn't deny that brain events are linked with experiential events. It's just that we're not very, we're nowhere towards kind of, we're really no better place than Descartes was to work out how those two things interact with each other.
And I was just going to say, what I picked up from what you're saying, Catherine, too, is being a conscious being is really interesting, right? And it's no wonder that people are interested in philosophy or mystical states of consciousness, because there are different ways of approaching the same thing, aren't they? One's like a intellectual kind of investigation through rigorous principles. Another one is like a kind of ascetic experience where you undergo some kind of privation usually so that you can have an altered state of consciousness. And the third path obviously is through drugs and alcohol, which likewise a lot of people get into because they're quite intrigued, about playing with that experience of being myself. And like you say, like on ketamine, people report leaving their body and things like that. And on a similar note, when I was younger, I was quite interested in these things, and I taught myself to lucid dream, and I got pretty good at it. There was like a psychologist who wrote a book on the subject and gave some kind of pretty good tips, but it was quite a discipline. I had to keep a dream journal and set an alarm and do all this stuff. But anyway, I got to a point where I could have what seemingly felt like an out of body experience. Do you know that feeling when you would you go to lie down to sleep and you're about to fall asleep and you kind of jump and you wake yourself up? Well, you teach yourself to resist that experience of jumping. And sometimes you have this experience where you're sliding out of bed really gradually. It's a really weird feeling. And normally you would jump and wake yourself up, but instead of jumping, suddenly you feel yourself fall out and you land on the floor and you stand up and your body's still on the bed. It's the strangest thing. But I fiddled around with it long enough to for myself at the very least to kind of conclude that it was a kind of trick of the mind, because I would look around the room and notice whether everything was exactly the same. And then when I'd wake up, I'd check, and it would be the weirdest variations. Like I'd imagine there was like a Chinese vase or something, and there's no Chinese vase in my room. But it felt so real. It felt really, really real. But my mind just could not get the details right, I guess. And they call them twilight states, and like Judith's saying, they're not well understood, but they're an interesting phenomenon, these twilight states, where somehow you're halfway between waking and sleeping. Your brain's releasing chemicals that paralyzes the body, so it can't run away because it's about to fall into a dream sleep. But if you keep the dream sleep very light, you're also semi-aware of being awake, and so it kind of allows you to have these weird experiences of your body and your sense of consciousness. It's fascinating to tinker around with. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate where you're coming from. I think it's really super interesting. And I think we get into this stuff because we want to know, what does it mean to have a mind? What does it mean to have a soul, if there's such a thing? And we get really creative in looking for ways to discover some sort of, I don't know, what's the word, veil that we can tear open and look on the other side of. And this is exactly what these consciousness researchers are doing. They're just doing it in a different way, aren't they? That's very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. And when you think about it, we're not, well, the scientists aren't actually any closer either in really establishing how life came about. I mean, if you look at leaving aside consciousness for a minute, if you look at the latest theories about the origins of life, it's X billion years ago, and we think that we've got some single cellular kind of organisms or proto-organisms that may or may not denote the origins, eukaryotes or whatever they're called. But yeah, it's kind of all a bit, it's very speculative even now. And yeah, I mean, science can't tell us really why there's something rather than nothing, and B, why there's life.
And on that,
So
Judith, apparently life began very suddenly. Like there was like a short period where it sort of just erupted and sort of came out of this primordial soup. And there was a lady on the radio today, and she studies meteorites, and there was a it was called Orion Rex was the name of the program, and they managed to land some sort of, I don't know, probe on some meteorite asteroid, and harvest some material, 100 grams, that's all, brought it back to Earth. And they picked this particular spot on the asteroid because it was quite dark, and they were looking, hoping it would be carbon. And it turns out it was quite rich in organic carbon, and that carbon had amino acids and proteins, the kind of things that could eventually become nucleotides and things like that, that are used in DNA and RNA and things like that. So the theory is that it's quite plausible that at some early part of the development of the Earth, when it had this kind of um, a lot of water around, I guess, that an asteroid, a meteorite, could have landed, bringing material from outer space, which becomes the kind of catalyst for organic life on Earth. So, yeah, we don't just grow out of the earth, we grow out of the entire cosmos. It's really interesting. I mean, they don't know, but it looks that way. It looks interesting.
yeah, but it would have to be on a planet that, yeah, had the particular temperature settings and as you say, the water, obviously, but also the geological environment that was appropriate for life. So yeah, it's kind of it was kind of an improbable thing to happen, I guess.
It's a bit like God coughing onto an agar dish or something.
That's right. And the other thing is too, I don't want to come across like I don't want to come across like anti-science, because obviously I'm not. Science is amazing, and part of the reason why what David Chalmers did in the 90s by actually, laying it out there that it was at a point where science was so seemingly so pervasive and had made so many great advances, particularly in medicine, and in all kinds of biological science. It's not that I'm dissing science at all. It's the idea that science has the tools and the paradigms to explain everything, which at the moment it doesn't, even though that some of its partisans would have you believe that it does.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that, and I think Catherine touched on it, that the way we see the world really shapes um, our ethical response to things in the world. So, if we're hardcore scientists and, in the scientism kind of sense of the word, and there's no such thing as, consciousness out there outside of higher order organic beings, then it means that we can kind of exploit the world and make it for our own use. But then again, what does it say to us about the cosmos or the earth if we find that it is conscious in some sort of way? I mean, it brings a different ethical responsibility for us, and maybe that means we can take climate change more seriously and things like that. Of course it affects us, and we should think about it in terms of that, but maybe it creates a richer ethical framework or dimension through which we can think about our commitments to things other than just other human beings. um, and I'm always intrigued about that. Someone wrote an article recently, I think it was Massimo, on Stoicism, and he was quoting John Sellers in a very long paragraph, and he was saying, Stoicism is not about techniques, it's about having a particular philosophy that transforms the way you look at the world so that you can act in alignment with things, in alignment with the kind of natural creature that you are. And what that means to me is that we have to find a philosophy that fits, that allows us to fit ethically and into the world in the most effective way, that does us justice, does to the kind of thing that we are. That kind of question of consciousness brings other things other than just some sort of subjective, objectivism. It also brings our intentionality, what it means to be this kind of creature, this kind of commitments and so on. Yeah.
Another sphere in which all these questions are very live, of course, is the whole AI thing going on. And so where Chalmers had his thought experiment about the P zombies, these zombies that do everything that humans do, but don't actually have subjective experience the way we do. You wouldn't actually know. And so all the ideas around, AI, is it actually conscious in a sense? Is it actually intelligent? Well, mostly we'd probably say not. But again, this also brings up, as you say, Courtney, these ideas around our responsibilities in this environment where we have these very powerful machines, in a sense, which is what they are, but which are kind of approximating or even simulating consciousness. What are our responsibilities in a world in which they are also actors? That's another interesting wrinkle here.
Yeah, and on that note, he made a point, didn't he, that about the Turing test. And again, I must listen to the radio a lot. Apparently, one of those chat bots has actually passed the Turing test now. Turing test. And it was interesting to read because I always forget numbers, but basically he was saying, according to Turing, the test was something like it had to fool 70% of the people within 5 minutes that it was a human being. The setup is, if a human being is talking to an AI and a human being, but each of them are behind a wall, for it to pass the test, it has to fool the interlocutors 70% of the time within 5 minutes, which all sounds very arbitrary, like why 5 minutes and why 70% of people. And I think that's what Goff was kind of saying too, is that well, why does it have to be about behavior anyway? That's not necessarily a good test. He's just saying that the behavior can fool another human being. It doesn't really say that it's a thinking thing, that it's a conscious being. So his conclusion was it's far from being conscious, and so it could be scary because it's a powerful technological tool, but not as scary as a lot of people are making out. It's not like it's some sort of evil kind of intelligence that is. And he's sort of suggesting that we're still a long, long way off, if ever we could create such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think several different variants of Turing tests have kind of been swept away. So, for instance, with art, if you look at some of the AI art, not some of the more kind of generic of it, but some of them better, I suppose, is the term, maybe. But you can look at it and think and not know whether it's a genuine medieval painting or something done by AI. So that's a kind of a Turing test in itself. And AI has certainly swept some of those barriers past. But I think what Chalmers and Goff are trying to get us to think about is whether any of that manifests ultimately as something conscious. And I mean, yeah, my instincts are with Goff that they don't, that ChatGPT, for example, which apparently even the latest version can't get basic spelling right or stuff like that. No, so that's not what we would call intelligent. But you know, these kind of developments are at least purporting to approximate what we understand to be intelligence or consciousness. So yeah, I mean, and of course, all those kind of the people who are into that are all very drawn to this kind of theorizing and so on. I mean, yeah, they all grew up on Chalmers and his hard and soft problems. So they're all that's their world essentially.
I'm thinking of Schopenhauer anyway, and if ChatGPT ever does get so hyper intelligent and develops consciousness, it's likely just to commit suicide anyway.
Well, that's exactly right. So, and of course, this comes back to the whole evolutionary worldview, right? So um, one of the many things about human life that evolution has never been able to account for is the propensity to suicide, which has been observed as part of human life since the beginning. So yet again, the scientific worldview has been unable to kind of account for a key human characteristic. So yes, good point. Probably, yeah. So yes. So yes, what other things did you want to talk about? I mean,
I could say one more thing about that ethical engagement thing too, and relate it to psychology. I'm really interested in Carl Rogers' work from way back, the 50s, because as everyone knows, he's interested in counseling and therapy and things. He kind of put that unconditional positive regard on the map, and he made his clients their own agents, and that it was important for the therapist, doctor, whatever, to not impose their expertise on the process of the client in their actualization. And he had two kind of principles that were organizing his thoughts, his philosophy. And one of these was what he called the formative tendency. And it's basically what we're talking about. It had this idea that nature's somehow conscious. And although it's the formative tendency is an idea that less complex things tend to clump together towards greater complexity. So there's a telos here, but the telos is towards complexity. And I guess he takes consciousness, or at least advanced types of consciousness, as a marker of complexity. So it's not random or accidental, but rather part of the ordered um, the ordering of nature, that it just gravitates towards greater complexity, which is interesting. And on the micro level, because that's more at the cosmic level, and the micro level of the formative tendency is the actualizing tendency, which everyone talks about now in self-help magazines, or we don't have magazines anymore, do we? Self-help YouTube videos. It's this idea that the individual organism is constantly striving for its enhancement towards greater complexity, and that there's a kind of telos implied in that too. And I think Goff mentioned that teleological perspective as an alternative to the regular kind of mechanistic cause and effect of, things flowing from the past to the present. But if we could have a more teleological perspective, trying to align the present with more with the kind of future telos, or however he was conceiving of that working. That's kind of how I see Rogers thinking of therapy. He's thinking about the telos of the client, which is the end state of the organism, which it's already reaching out for towards, and inevitably, because of the structure of the cosmos and the organism, it will do anything in its power to kind of actualize itself and be what it is made to be, sort of thing. And we just have to get out of the way. We just have to try and minimize the belief barriers, if you like, the kind of restraints that a person or a society places on the individual organism and prevents it from actualizing itself. And so his the consequence of such a philosophy, if you think about it, revolutionizes a therapeutic approach. So it has real powerful implications for the way we treat other people. So Rogers is really talking about treating people with absolute dignity and rational respect. And because he can see as an organism they're striving towards their ends, despite whether or not you like their behavior or not, there's something deeper going on, you know, that this frustrated organism is doing whatever it can to actualize itself. I just think it's really important to think of the consequences and the way it transforms our mode of being in the world and our interactions with other people. We can have very positive philosophies. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Courtney. I suppose it also comes down to, and this is where, again, yeah, the ancients had the idea of a telos to people's lives. Nowadays, we don't have we don't have an idea of a telos. And so we're a bit confused about what it is to have a good life, essentially. What does that actually involve? What does somebody actualizing themselves actually involve? What is it for someone to develop themselves and their life along the best possible path? We're kind of, I mean, you work in the biz. What do people imagine, or what do professionals imagine that involves?
Well, I don't know, but that's why I like what the Stoics are talking about, because I imagine that they agree somewhat with Rogers, that we've got internal capacities as an organism, and virtue is the um, ultimate kind of expression of those capacities, which are rational in nature, ultimately, um, and that the creature that is able to fully actualize its organismic capacities, for want of another word, um, is virtuous, is completely excellent. And what does that look like? Well, it definitely doesn't mean the creature can't suffer like injury from the external environment, but I still think it fits with the Stoic expression. It's not about feeling good all the time. It's not about avoiding discomfort, but it is about knowing that you have everything you need in your nature to cope with the kind of world that you live in because you're fitted with nature. And with that sort of absolute self-awareness, consciousness of your capacities, and trust in yourself, you'll be fine in life and you'll just live out your existence for as long as it's given to you. I think it's as simple as that, to be honest. And I think that's what a good, robust therapy ought to be trying to do. But obviously, therapy nowadays is confused because there's a lot of competing ideas of what the good life looks like. Is it about pleasure? Is it about wealth? Is it about getting your needs met, whatever they are? Because clearly, what we mean by needs is not the same thing as actualizing your organismic capacities. I think that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was probably what I was getting at with, as a culture, we're not very good at seeing what, or at least even stating what a good life looks like. Is it to do with, pleasure or status or stuff like that? Yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion about that. But yeah, I think what Goff's worldview has going for it is a couple of different things. And one of them is, yeah, trying to make a coherent metaphysical system. So I think he's doing that. But also I think, yeah, there's promotion of agency at every level, from the simplest to the most complex, must be a good thing, and must reinforce, as you say, that ultimately we are equipped. Not everybody is. I mean, some people are suffering with a particularly severe form, I suppose, of incapacity in some ways. But most people, by and large, have got the capacity to live, to cope with what comes to them in life. And that's part of what consciousness is, right? And that's part of what agency is. And so, yeah, I think, as I say, Goff's worldview has got that going for it.
Another thing too is science disposes of metaphysics by relying on observation and experimentation, and it considers everything else that doesn't, not science, scientism, that, and anything else that doesn't um, rely solely on observation, empirical observation, is metaphysical. And that's what Goff's saying. Well, that's just anything other than science is metaphysical and therefore philosophical. Interestingly, it's the phenomenologists who also pick up on this kind of scientism. And I think it's because Husserl saw himself as following in Descartes' footsteps when he wrote his Cartesian Meditations. And if you notice, the phenomenologists, in a completely different way than how science does it, wants to dispose of all metaphysics as well. And the way that they do it is by observing only the phenomena and bracketing out through the very similar technique that Descartes talked about, the skeptical method, the epoche, the bracketing out of any other assumption or explanatory kind of theory. That gets bracketed out, and only the phenomenon, only that is observed and dealt with, which is interesting. Because I've read Stollerow and Atwood are a couple of psychiatrists who call themselves phenomenological psychiatrists or whatever, and they talk about diagnostic criteria in mental health stuff like the DSM and all that as metaphysics. Just like Freudian theory would be metaphysics, attachment theory, metaphysics, everything metaphysics. So technically, as a phenomenologist, you would bracket all those assumptions out and throw them away because they have nothing to do with direct observation. They already bring with it the kind of contamination of the metaphysical world. So interesting how science and phenomenology see metaphysics as contamination, contaminating the material objective phenomenon that one is faced with.
That was how that article from David Chalmers that I shared, and I haven't even read the whole article, but he starts off um, brilliantly, in my view, saying in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, we had this unmediated perception of a red apple, that the experience of red was direct. But, after the fall of man, we were having to infer the redness of the apple through the barrier of sense perception and stuff. So he kind of gets to that idea that in some what I presume what the phenomenologists were trying to do in some sense was put that experience of the red apple as primary, right? That it was direct and somehow unmediated, and therefore authentic and not a representation in any respect, but a direct apprehension of the redness of the apple. I guess that's what phenomenology is about. On the other hand, doesn't that kind of leave you open to the idealist worldview? The craziness of Bishop Berkeley that, well, actually, um, the red apple is like everything else in the world. It's just an idea. It's just a spirit. It's just an idea in the mind of God. It's not actually a red apple. It's not actually red, and it's not actually an apple. It's just an idea. So in a sense, I mean, I actually like the phenomenological perspective in the sense that it does take the world as we find it in some respect, but also on another level, if we're just talking about phenomena, the things that appear to us, obviously, that can be laid open to the skeptical perspective. For example, so you might feel that it's cold when it's actually a really hot day out there. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that focusing on phenomena as such is a kind of an answer, maybe.
Yeah, I think it asks different questions, doesn't it? So I always struggled to really understand phenomenology, but I think you hit the nail on the head basically about um, you don't take the person out of the world, it comes part and parcel. I don't think it's about apples per se as distinct from that particular apple in the world that I'm experiencing right now. So it's about particulars, isn't it? It's about the world of becoming. It's not about the world of being. It's not about static ideas. It's about um, the constant ebb and flow of time and reality, and I think that's where it is interesting, because it takes into account context and history and your own experience, and it embeds all these things into the experience of the apple, so it can't ever be an apple without you. And we're intentional creatures in phenomenology. That is, we never even have an idea about it, about all our ideas about things are about things in the world, which is kind of an interesting thing when you think about it. Like, generally speaking, unless you're talking about yourselves kind of transcendental objects, which are like your personality or something, or something that happened in the past. Generally, when we have mental events, they don't exist completely disconnected from the world, because they always have an aboutness. They're always about things in the world. And things in the world, when we encounter them, are never just like a chair. There's a chair. The chair has an aboutness for us. So it's like a thing I sit on, it's a thing that feels smooth or whatever. Like, it's a thing that I have a personal engagement with, in a sense, in a way that makes it impossible for me to be completely disconnected from it in that kind of consciousness versus substance kind of Cartesian way. I'm always already kind of connected with it in some way through my awareness of it. I think that's what it does well, and I think that's what it seeks to do, is to embed us in the world and show us that we're not distinct, isolated egos who kind of somehow survey the world around us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. Well, I'm kind of tempted to, come to the end, and unless there's something that you guys wanted to bring up that we haven't talked about. I mean, we've kind of covered quite a lot of ground as it is.
I know we've been
Um,
going on about all sorts of stuff. Catherine, you must have something to kind of share.
Yeah, probably just touching on that space time, because I know that that's a divisive issue as well, like where space time fits within consciousness, and our experience of time, like yeah, how things can slow down or speed up depending on your, emotional state or state of consciousness and your moods, just how transient they can be. Like if you're aware of that, then it can be quite scary to go, oh, why am I feeling this? And, sometimes there's really not a logical reason for a lot of your emotions and your feelings. Or, even I suppose like some of the bigger issues, like I don't know if you guys have like fallen in love at first sight or anything like that, but they're really profound experiences that you don't even know if the other person knows, like it's an internal experience and it's a profound experience. And I don't think language fully captures so much of what we're trying to discuss. I think it's sort of an inadequate way to make sense of the world and put things in categories. But yeah, the experience is just so much more than what can be spoken about, isn't it? I suppose. And consciousness too. Like they're just so big, so huge.
That's an interesting point. I was reading a completely different article today on men's behavior change stuff, but they were talking about Vygotsky, I think he was a Russian, wasn't he? The guy had that scaffolding idea, and he was talking about that he observed children, but they use this stuff in education and teaching, and the idea is that people have these internal private experiences, but until they learn, like through scaffolding, develop the language structures around it for them to be able to articulate them and match their private intuitions or experiences with this kind of language world, then they can share them, and then they have this kind of critical reflective capacity that allows them to kind of learn and unpack. So the language aspect is actually incredibly important for us, the kind of creatures that we are, because without that we can't really learn, we can't really critically analyze it and work out how to move forward and change ourselves, for example. We just kind of do it in a, otherwise we do it in a kind of haphazard, well, I don't know if it's haphazard, but just not in a kind of efficient way, I assume. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah.
Well, maybe it can't be expressed to another person easily, like you might experience it, but yeah, if it can't be articulated, then it's hard to convey. And then, of course, it's the issue of that person, depending on their different personal experiences. You know, what you say is just in language, and how is that message received? You actually never truly know.
Yeah, it's an interesting example. And isn't it frustrating when you have an experience and you feel something, but you really don't know what to make of it, and you don't know how to express it, and you don't know how to describe it. And maybe that's the kind of fuel that gets poetry off the ground, where a person's trying to say something they've never been able to kind of fully express. And I mean, personally, when I've had experiences like that, it can be incredibly frustrating until maybe through talking to other people. And I guess this is the whole Socratic dialectical kind of thing, through some sort of uh yeah, talking and learning process, I'm able to say something which gets closer to it, and I feel like, that's interesting, there's a light bulb moment, that helps, that's really great. And you see that sort of stuff happening in therapy, for example, is that people have, they don't know why they do what they do, and they have feelings about what they do, but they just can't explain it to themselves. It seems like they just have no agency until they have a moment where they can articulate it. Sometimes that really helps, not always, but sometimes that's what's required for them to say, now I know what it is, and now I can own it, and now I can move on, for example. So all very interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's I mean, humans are creatures, we're speaking organisms. Where language is uniquely human, and yeah, it's hard for us to even conceive of operating in the world without it. So that's how fundamental it is. And so, in a sense, yes, it's it's also ordering our lives through speech and writing. That is what we're doing all the time. And obviously, yeah, connecting with other people through speech and writing is what we're doing it all the time. So, and this is another interesting, sorry, this is a sidebar. This is another thing that Chalmers has talked about, which is extended cognition. The idea that, well, actually, when we're writing our thoughts down in a notebook, our notebook actually is also part of our thinking in the world. Or when we're having a conversation, our interaction is also part of our thinking in the world. We're not necessarily just we're not just brains in heads. We're writers, we're talkers, we're thinkers. Our notebooks, our computers, they're all part of our cognition, our reasoning in the world. So extended cognition, I think, is a really powerful idea that Chalmers has come up, or not come up with. I don't think it was original, but he's championed that idea that this is also how we operate in the world. This is part of our phenomenology.
There's this in the new science of cognition or whatever, they got this four E's now, don't they? Extension, embeddedness, I think it is, enacted. That's where you get enactivism, and like I can't remember the fourth one. But this idea of extended cognition is really interesting. And when you think about it, like you're right, it starts out with pen and paper. So, but we are now extending our cognitive processes into the external world around us. We've always done it with things like stop signs and stuff like that, but now we're doing it with like GPS satellites and things like that. So in a way, we're outsourcing our internal cognitive processes onto technologies around us that basically, exactly as Judith was saying, means that our cognition, our cognitive powers, if you like, are extended out into the environment all around us, everywhere. So this is about having blurry boundaries. I don't just live in my head. I'm very much doing my thinking with the things in the world around me. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful idea. And again, it comes back to agency. We're all these co-agents in the world. Um, and all our technology is also our tool in the world, if you like. So yeah, it's
And it's very practical because computer engineer types and software people are working out how they can um, facilitate different types of extended cognition through different technologies. You can imagine all kinds of technological advances, like the mobile phone is another version of it, or if people have disabilities of a certain type, like how they can perform the functions that their body would normally perform for them or their mind would normally perform for them, but technology is able to, for example, take the load and do it for them. Like it's got an enormously powerful kind of potential for builders and engineers and all sorts of people. It's really interesting.
and it's kind of enhanced agency, really, if you think about it that way. It's not only do we have our own agency, but all these tools and connections are enhancing it, and in a kind of an exponential way. It's kind of exciting in that sense.
Definitely. I know Catherine wanted to do Merleau-Ponty, but we could do a chapter out of that book. It was very interesting. Mark Rowland, I think. I only got through the first couple of chapters, but it was about extended cognition, the four E's, whatever they are, extension, em embedded, enacted. Enactivism is really interesting for all this stuff that we're talking about. And like it dovetails really nicely into the things that we were talking about with phenomenology being in the world and our cognition extended into the world, the fuzzy boundaries between us and the world and other people. It's could be cool.
So, sorry, what book was this, Courtney? I wasn't sure.
It's called The New Science of Cognition or something. It's in the list of books in the files. I think it's Mark Rowland is the author. I can post it again. It,
Yeah, would you mind? I think that sounds great.
it's called The New Science of the Mind from Extended Mind to Embodied Phenomenology.
Well, that sounds is it a whole book though?
It is, but we could pick a couple of chapters.
Yeah, well, let's do that. That sounds great.
And that will set us up for Merleau-Ponty after that, because I think Merleau-Ponty might be a little bit abstract, whereas this is quite grounded. It's like talks about how we do use things like this. Yeah.
Okay, well, that sounds great.
Cool,
Well,
man.
thank you,
So
guys.
we'll wrap it up.
We've just scratched the surface, but so much to think about. And when we do our thinking in company like this, um, yeah, we just spark ideas out off each other, and we enhance each other's learning. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's great. It's so good to reflect on the journey too. Like I often think, oh my God, I feel like I've learnt nothing. And then when we get together, it's like we can jump from Plato to the phenomenologist and Descartes, and it's kind of, oh, that's cool. It's neat.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, guys.
Thanks, Judith. Thanks, Catherine. Have a great weekend.
Thank
See you
you.
again soon. Bye.
Bye.